This session is asking the question, is there room for volunteer leaders? And while it might be a really easy, straightforward question, I'm sure it's not. And we've asked our speakers to have a go at answering that question, but also to give us some pithy advice that they can about how Red Cross might move into a space where it creates more opportunities for volunteer leaders. So that's the task for today, and I'm hoping that your questions that will come from the floor will be equally interesting and challenging, and don't be frightened to ask a challenging question because these people sitting here are very equipped to answer that. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our first speaker. I'm going to talk about them individually as they come up because it's a lot to take in the first session. So our first speaker here is Ms. Christine Couture, who is the Leader in Residence. She's a strategist, facilitator of Leadership Victoria. Christine is the inaugural Leadership Victoria Leader in Residence, a role that is increasing awareness of and solutions to some of the most pressing leadership challenges currently facing organisations, businesses and governments today. She's a highly regarded designer and contributor to leadership development programs, and she's helped strengthen governance, planning and strategy for lots of organisations around Australia. And as a skilled facilitator, she's facilitated consultations for the 2009 Bushfires Royal Commission, the 2011 Flood Review, government reviews of 2013 Harrietville fires, and more recently, the 2014 Hazelwood Mine Inquiry. Chris has a distinguished career as an executive, a ministerial advisor, chief executive, pro-vice chancellor, senior research fellow, and as a council and board member, director and trustee. So Chris is a regular member of key government panels. She's undertaken extensive leadership and management development at Harvard University and holds degrees in art and education. She's also a very active member of prominent CEO and Chancellor circles, and she's a fellow of the Williamson Community Leadership Program, an alumni of the Granada Program, and a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. So what a resume to come to the table with. Well done. So I'd like you to join in me in giving a very warm welcome to Miss Christine Couture. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't Google yourself, will you? It's just not helpful. I'm not from the Red Cross, and I really appreciate the invitation for someone who's an admirer and a fan, but also works outside your organisation, but has had exposure to a lot of your work, and at the same time, a lot of work around volunteering and volunteers. And because I work across all the different sectors, I've got some different insights perhaps about the value of volunteers and how organisations and we in the community can extract the most from volunteering. It's also wonderful to be part of an organisation that's got a centenary. I often think that this is a mixed blessing, that organisations that are mature and have been around for a very, very long time can say that they know it all. And at the same time, history's got really strong momentum. So I hope over the next couple of minutes we can stare a little harder into the future and see where this world of volunteering might take us and where we might go. I think you're in a great starting place for this conversation. You already have a strong policy around volunteering. You've got deep experience and a long history, so it's a fabulous time to be having this kind of conversation. So 1 second on a definition of leadership, given that that's our starting point. In my presentation, I'm really thinking about leadership as a way of directing people's attention and energy. So I'm not thinking about necessarily people in leadership positions, in a hierarchy, or even in an organisation, but people who, through their efforts and who they are and what they do, direct other people's energy and attention. And because we're talking here about the Red Cross, we're hoping that they will take our energy and point us in the direction that will actually improve people's lives. So there's a lot to be gained by the concept of volunteers as leaders. You see, I've answered that question straight off. I think you have no choice but to think about volunteers and leadership in the one sentence. It's an opportunity for the Red Cross to really expand authority, reach and influence if you make the most of volunteers. It's an opportunity to be much more strategic. Our volunteers can see trends that organisations can't or won't. They often have a much more direct, intimate feel with what's going on around us. They're a fabulous opportunity to collect data, information about what works, what doesn't work. Fabulous opportunity to hothouse or test tube new ideas for products and services. And volunteers are a great way to scale up innovation. And innovation is one of those things that lots of organisations talk about. We bang on about innovation all the time, but most of us don't like change very much. And so volunteers are a fabulous way of thinking about how you get scale when you find out what works really well. So what's going on out there? The way I see things might be a little bit different to your experience. I've seen a big change, and not just with young people, but particularly with young people, about volunteering as part of their career paths. They're certainly there to make a contribution, but they're also trying to parlay that experience into the answer to what's next. Where do I go? How do I build my CV? How can I make a contribution? So for them, there's a different sort of values proposition. I see a lot of pop-up volunteering and leadership, if I can put it that way. A lot of effort around particular events, the episodic, hard events that we used to think would take place once every 100 years, but now take place, it seems to me at least, just about every year. And they're life-changing events. They are often unexpected, unwelcome, and often really show where communities are resilient or where they need additional support. So that role in preparing, being there during events, and certainly being there the other side of it is where I see a lot of leadership. Now, the reason I say it's pop-up is because it can be episodic. People make their volunteer contribution and then disappear. In other words, they don't necessarily sign up to an organisation or claim to want to be there in the long haul. So I guess over the years I've noticed a change in the sorts of events that make us give a damn. They're quite different for a lot of us. It's often not about a long-term attachment or lifelong loyalty, though it's fabulous when you see that. The other is that I see a number of volunteers who, and this is a really fabulous opportunity for leadership, who act like they're anthropologists, sociologists and psychologists. They might not deliberately set out to do that, but they really do study people and behaviours and how minds work. Now, an organisation that can tap that has got a huge opportunity to grow its own intellectual property. How's that, to have a huge number of well-meaning, smart people out there with those sorts of perspectives to bring back into the organisation? And the volunteers that I've worked with and the number of organisations and companies that I work with as well and who recognise this, realise that we are all at one time both practitioners of leadership and trainees. In other words, we exercise leadership in what we do, and at the same time we're always learning about better ways to be stronger volunteers. So I think in the organisations where I've worked, where there is a real sense of putting the words leadership and volunteering together, it starts out with recruitment. In other words, looking quite hard at the sort of people and their skills and what they know and what they're able to do that they bring to the organisation. So the first of these is one about people's motives, about why they volunteer. And I guess the volunteers that I see now, and I suspect into the future, that are really effective, are those that bring ambition rather than pity to their work, if I can make that distinction. It's a very, very different mindset to work with people because you have ambition for them rather than you feel sorry for them. The next is very deliberate, conscious efforts to have recruitment strategies that reflect a diverse community, particularly the communities that I know really well around Victoria and particularly around Australia, are very diverse. And you look at your volunteer body, and the organisations where I've had this experience look quite hard at ensuring that they have a diverse volunteer group so that they reflect the communities in which they work. They also look quite hard for people with, if I describe it as emotional health, I mean something about attitude and the way they feel about the work. Graham Greene talked about having a thin slice of ice around your heart. And I see some of the most effective volunteering work involves people who have detachment. That's not to say that they don't care and that they're not deeply involved, but they don't appropriate other people's stories. In fact, they stay detached and a bit aloof and really think hard about how they can make a difference rather than have other people's stories become their own. Now, there are also risks. If we go down this path of attaching the word leadership to volunteering, it's because as soon as you do that, you give people teeth, and they might use them. So there are some risks. You see, if you think about people as leaders in organisations, they're likely to bring about change. They're likely to disrupt patterns and rhythms and maybe challenge, maybe even violate some long-held views. I actually like that, but not all organisations do. And whilst they do bang on about change a lot, they often put kind of immunity in place because change feels like a virus. We actually like to keep people at a distance because they might disrupt what we think is normal and effective. So what leadership can do in organisations is actually bring in some fear. Powers shifting, how did that happen? I think it's an invitation to think really creatively and bring about new ways of thinking about the best work into the future. They can rattle complacency, and they want, I'm sure you know this, training and support, because quite often they're on their way to somewhere else. This is part of their journey, not the destination. And they want to be able to parlay this experience into the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And they want some support and some wisdom and direction to how to do that. So where I've seen, I guess, this concept work really well, and by that I mean the word leadership wrapped in around, braided, and impossible to break away from the word volunteering. Where it's worked well, there's been real purpose in strategic planning, both in the process and the product, to think very carefully about this word leadership in relation to volunteers. In other words, it has come from the top and it's been part of the process all the way through. Now, strategic planning is one of those things that I facilitate a lot of, and I'm very conscious that most people at the thought of going to another strategic planning session would rather eat their own kidneys, but it really is an opportunity to think quite hard about how you make the best of people who can exercise leadership in the organisation. The next is there are deliberate efforts to develop leaders. I mean, actual leadership development. And that's about two things. One is, what do leaders need to know? And what do they need to be able to do? So that's about content knowledge, and it's about action. And this is done quite specifically and in a structured way. I have found over the years that leadership development is a really interesting piece of my work. I have found that telepathy and mind reading and holding your breath until you turn purple, hoping that people understand something about leadership development, doesn't work. But leadership development that's carefully thought through and structured can and does. The organisations that I'm thinking of can expand people's roles, make them part of committees, think tanks, publish knowledge, not just stories, but knowledge about what works, what doesn't. Use volunteers as students of failure. In other words, understanding what works and what doesn't work. And instead of running away from mistakes or things that don't work quite so smoothly, actually interrogate that and use those lessons for improvement. Recognition and awards work really well, particularly at local levels. And the last point that I'd make is that there is a whole world out there that I'm sure you know really well that uses mobile technologies and smartphones and has these as our little best friends, and we start to get anxious when we're not looking at these because we think that we're not relevant. Maybe that's just me. Nobody's talking to me. What's going on? Have I been forgotten? And at the same time, I think about some of the major campaigns and the ways of drawing people together and connecting people through this that are quite extraordinary. And the organisations that I'm thinking of have got it. They've actually worked out that volunteers can do their best work without organisations. They don't need you. They can actually go over your heads and connect up with other people who are like-minded, want to make the same kind of effort, and they just do it. In fact, large organisations or bureaucracies or systems or committees, in fact, turn off a number of people who want to be volunteers. So the organisations that I'm thinking of have really got hold of the idea that this is your friend as opposed to a communication device. It is a way of connecting people in extraordinarily powerful ways, and without that, they'll do it anyway. So I wish you well in the next little while as you think and talk about this, and I'd really love to continue that conversation. So I love the idea of an organisation that is having a conversation that tries to make the best of its past, to make the most of the future. And I really wish you well in doing that, so thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Christine. There's about 10 questions I'd like to ask you, but I won't. I'd like to just make a quick comment, I guess. I guess what you've done for us is actually sort of set the scene for us, which I think is a really good thing for a conversation like this, in the fact that coming from an outside gives a different perspective to an organisation. So I'm just going to open it up now for a couple of questions from the floor. So is there anybody who'd like to ask a clarifying question? We have a gentleman down here, and we've got one behind. Have we got hand mics? Or if you've got a loud voice? Oh, you can handle a voice, yes, obviously. Okay, then would you like to stand up, please, and just say where you're from? And is your question to Christine?
Definitely to Christine.
Okay.
Ian Gray, I'm Victorian Red Cross. First thing I'd like to say is I think you're wrong.
Okay.
Within the framework of what I'm looking at the moment, everything you've said has enormous relevance in a city, in an immediately urban area. It has very little in that situation where you spread your community out because you don't have the numbers to work with.
Okay. All right. Okay, so your question is about how might you manage this? It would work well in an urban area, for those at the back who didn't quite hear that, but when the numbers are spread out, that might be much more complex. Yeah.
A situation
Yeah. Okay.
Communication and transport are very much part of the situation.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you like-
I really appreciate your question. I guess
Is your
most of
mic working? Can we have the hand mic again? Sorry.
most of the work that I've been drawing on in the last couple of years has come from away from Melbourne. If I think about the Bushfires Royal Commission, that worked over 23 different shires out of Melbourne, all the way through to the Hazelwood Mine Fire Inquiry at the beginning of this year. My comments are really about often very local communities where I think people have multiple affiliations. They actually volunteer in lots and lots of different ways. Many people are already members of a school council or part of a sporting organisation or another organisation where volunteering is just braided into their lifestyle. I've seen lots of examples of exactly what you're talking about. I think there are real challenges in terms of numbers and transport and getting around. And whilst I talk about technology and mobile communications, not everybody is attached to a smartphone or has access. I'm really very aware of that. And at the same time, what I've seen, so there has been one distinction for me. For the people who have volunteered in those really significant moments that change communities forever, if I'm thinking about the cataclysmic events of fires, floods, the Hazelwood Mine Fire Inquiry, it's about something to do with how you sustain their interest and their resilience and their desire to keep volunteering, when in lots of cases people are spent. In fact, they've used up that one bottle of special juice at that one event. So I think that there's a way of thinking about how we start working with young people while they're still in schools, all the way through to people that say, oh, I don't have any time for volunteering because it's time hungry. So without going into lots of case studies, I'm optimistic about that. In fact, one of the things that I look for when I'm working in local communities and with organisations little like your own is that I think I think volunteering, I think the candidates for volunteering are people who have got confidence and hope. I don't think it's the work of cynics and skeptics, because it's not the kind of work where people who can't think their way through problems and issues, particularly at a local level, are drawn into the work. Now, I see a lot of that in communities outside of Melbourne, and I think it can work at lots and lots of different levels. I think this is where having a real strategy and thinking it through from their perspective is a really important piece of work to do. So I absolutely agree with your sentiment about the challenges involved away from a large urban environment.
Okay, thanks, Christine. Just time for one more quick question. Yes, this gentleman here.
Hello? Yes, sorry. More than once you seem to refer to volunteers as sources of information,
Yes.
environmental subjects. In the context of a discussion about perhaps putting volunteers in a more central and significant role, isn't it subordinating to take that line?
Oh, no, I think it's a high privilege. I think it is some of the loftiest work, that if you have got insights, information, experiences, ways of seeing when you're volunteering, it's almost, so I can see in some organisations how that work is almost privatised. In other words, it goes nowhere. And people reinvent wheels, and this sector, I'm not trying to be disparaging here, uses up a lot of energy and stamina in reinventing the wheels. In other words, there are fabulous pockets of great practice, and they often don't go anywhere because the connections are not made. So what I'm talking about is really raising the importance and the leadership potential of volunteers, because volunteers can see things and do things and have access to insights that often people in organisations or in head office are completely clueless about, not because they don't want to, but because they don't have the immediacy and they don't have that experience. So my point is about how you extract from those experiences ways of teaching the rest of us. And simple ways of doing it are to have a think tank every year, or a forum, or set up a centre of excellence of community leadership. I mean, there are lots of ways of having volunteers act as students and as teachers and make us all smarter.
Yes, so I see that you're referring to it on a consultative level rather than a data mining level.
Oh,
yes.
no, it's exactly. This is taking people's real life experience, particularly when it's grassroots and it's there in the moment, and lifting it to prominence in an organisation, rather than saying, oh, well, that was that episode, that was that period of time, that was that event, or that product, or that service. Now let's move on to the next one. My argument is much more about the lost opportunities if you don't grasp what people know and are able to do through their volunteering, and how it can enrich organisations.
And I think this is possibly going to be a conversation that's going to carry on afterwards, because I think you've opened a Pandora's box there.
Great.
I think it's a really good thing. But I want to move on now to our second speaker. And our second speaker is Brett Williamson, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Volunteering Australia. So Brett began his CEO job of Volunteering Australia in 2013, prior to being CEO of Surf Lifesaving for 6 years. He's a sports and physical education teacher, or he was, for several years prior to beginning his professional involvement with Surf Lifesaving in 1984, when he started in the dual role of State Development Officer and State Director of Coaching with Surf Lifesaving in Queensland. As Volunteering Australia's CEO, Brett is primarily responsible for ensuring the effective development, management and sustainability of an organisation and its vital services and what it can produce. The unique and diverse nature of the organisation's operation requires Brett's extensive engagement with governments, with corporate organisations, the community sector on volunteering and the not-for-profits. He sits on the board of Community Council for Australia and on the Australian Emergency Management Volunteer Forum. And in 2004, he received the Order of Australia Medal. So welcome, Brett. The forum is yours.
Thanks, Pat. Obviously, the conference organisers couldn't find another Chris for the panel. So, firstly, whilst I'm relatively new to Volunteering Australia, I've been a long-term fan and admirer of Red Cross, and it's a great privilege to be here at your Centenary Summit. And coming down from Canberra today, I couldn't help but fondly reflect on my previous role in surf lifesaving, and I had the fortune to have a fair bit to do with the centenary celebrations of surf lifesaving. And it's great that your agenda for the year is not just about celebrating, but it's also about looking and charting a course for the future. And we had a saying in Surf Lifesaving, said, we just don't want a hangover at the end of the year. We want to be providing a legacy and a foundation for the next 100 years, and I'm sure that's shared by Red Cross. Anyway, back to why we're here. I probably should also acknowledge Red Cross has a strong influence through volunteer leaders within Volunteering Australia. 2 of our directors come from Red Cross, and Michelle Ewington is up the back there, and Andrew Coughlin is also on the board, who's sitting up even further at the back. So it's great to see 2 of our directors here, and reflective of the great work beyond the obvious work or the public profile work that Red Cross obviously does. It's an organisation that I think is Australia's preeminent humanitarian organisation and global organisation as well. Back to the question. On the face of it, when I first was invited to speak, I thought, and saw the question, I thought, hang on, what's the trick here? You know, on the face of it, it's a simple answer, and the answer is, of course. Of course there should be room for volunteer leaders. I'm sure everyone would agree that building leadership capabilities is fundamental to the success of any enterprise, be it not-for-profit, be it a charity, be it in the private sector or in the public sector, in the government sector. So I thought, hang on, there must be more to it. So upon reflecting, there is some critical considerations I think you need to ask yourselves when thinking about the question. So if the answer is yes, and I think it's hard to argue against it, you must say, the next part is why? And some of the issues will repeat and be probably a common theme through the presentations by the Christines, Chris's and the one Brett. I mean, Red Cross is already a robust, efficient organisation doing great things. Why change? Is it to enhance the quality and scope of your humanitarian work? And following on from one of the sessions this morning, talking about the collaborative collective impact and collaboration. Is it to fill gaps in service provision or quality, or to create new projects? Is it to drive innovation, collect knowledge, experiences, skills that aren't necessarily in the organisation? Is it to drive diversity? Is it to increase that talent pool that Christine talked about, the intelligence talent pool? Is it to build resilience in local communities? Getting back to the point about sustainability, leaving a legacy. Is it to grow your supporter and donor base? Is it to grow your connections and influence in the advocacy work that you're doing? Is it about diversifying and engaging diversified groups? I mean, I'd suggest that a smart strategy for increasing volunteering, and particularly volunteering leaders, should be a tick to all of the above. What I suggest it isn't, or shouldn't be, is that it's a replacement program for paid staff. It should be about enhancing what you do and what you aspire to do. And if I borrow on the theme of your centenary, it's all about, the theme being people helping people. It's about more people, more skills, more talent, helping more people. So if we accept that you're ticking all the boxes on why, the challenge then is how. And I don't wish to oversimplify it, but really it's about workforce management 101. And forget about this notion of paid and unpaid. How do you develop leaders within your organisation? And it shouldn't be different between how you treat staff or paid staff to how you treat volunteers involved. So it's about understanding what the needs are of your organisation and comparing obviously with what your aspirations and goals are for your organisation, and looking at the workforce plan to meet that. It's about recruiting the right people. It's about developing and investing in developing the skills, talent, leadership skills within your people. And it's about rewarding and recognising. And obviously for volunteers, the reward is recognition, a pat on the back, and for paid staff, it's a salary as well as pat on the back and congratulations. It's about having an effective workforce plan. Will have clarity about roles and responsibilities. It'll be providing the necessary environment, tools, resources, so that people can do their job safely and effectively. It's all about, again, borrowing on some of the themes, the theme that came out of the last session before lunch. It's about effective internal collaboration and collective activity. So, short time left. So some of the pitfalls to avoid, or some of the things I've seen and to be wary of, or to consider. You don't want to duplicate roles. You don't want to have a paid person next to a volunteer person necessarily doing the same thing. You know, that does create perhaps duplication or confusion and potentially dissent. It's also, you need to be aware or make sure that you do understand the different motivations and aspirations of people, particularly the volunteers. As mentioned earlier, the younger generation see volunteering, not all of them, but an increasing number, as seeing it as a pathway into a career, into a new skill. They see it as part of a journey as opposed to an end in itself. Another pitfall would be not to invest enough in workforce development, and that's your people. Again, I'm not differentiating between paid and unpaid. And I suppose ultimately, but it goes right back to why. Your workforce plan, or the way you manage and develop and support your people, must support your organisational aspirations and goals. So the first thing to do is to sit down and say, what will success look like? And if you can answer that question, I know that I'm sure that Red Cross will continue to provide its excellent humanitarian services and more over the next century. So I'll finish up now. I look forward to some questions later on in the day. I hope you direct any hard questions to a Chris. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Oh no, Brett, sorry. You will notice that we're doing this thing like they do on the money program, that everyone moving along a seat as they move along, okay, and then we get to the $64,000 question at the end. Thank you very much for that. You've posed some quite interesting questions about like the why. Why do we actually want volunteer leaders? And I think you've been really clear about like they're not to replace paid staff, but I think it is often an interesting question. People often don't think about like, well, why do we actually want them? And we're going to hopefully hear a bit more about that, but hopefully have some questions about that at the end. So thank you very much, Brett. Okay, our third speaker is another Chris. So this time we have Chris Kwon, and we have a young person this time, no discredit to anybody else. But and after listening to those inspirational young women talk this morning about the energy of youth, it reminded me of my days when I used to march around London with something waving in my hand when I was about 18 or something. Anyway, our third speaker is Chris Kwon, and Chris is from the National Youth Advisory Board from the Australian Red Cross. So Chris first volunteered with the Australian Red Cross in 2008 and has served as a member of the International Humanitarian Law Committee of South Australia and founded the South Australian International Humanitarian Law Collective. He's also served as a member on the South Australian Youth Advisory Committee and the South Australian Divisional Advisory Board. In early 2011, he was made a co-opted member of the National Youth Advisory Committee to work with the Australian Red Cross staff to coordinate flash mob events around Australia to promote the Make Nuclear Weapons the Target campaign. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Chris.
Cool. Yep. Is that okay? Perfect. All right. I'm a bit more comfortable if I try and sit down and remind myself to make this more of a conversation. So thank you for the introduction, and a very generous one, Pat. When I was asked this question, I think I looked at it in 3 different ways. First of all, is the question asking me whether or not Australian Red Cross and being an Australian Red Cross volunteer presently has room for volunteer leaders. That was the first thought. Second question that I had as well was whether or not this question is actually asking, well, should there be room for volunteer leaders? And Brett's touched on that as well. And then thirdly, it also caused me to think of the same issue that Christine was addressing in terms of, well, what do we mean by leader? And so what I wanted to do is maybe just share some of my thoughts and experiences in relation to those 3 questions in probably reverse order, if that's okay. So first of all, in terms of leaders, I think I couldn't articulate it as well as Christine did, but for me, it comes down to, I think, 2 sort of compartments, if you like, if we can put it in compartments. Leaders in the formal sense, in terms of leaders who have formal authority, formal roles where they are the decision maker. There's, rules set in place for that. And obviously in the Australian Red Cross context, you're thinking in terms of our governance structure, the president, the board members, those sorts of things, as well as, of course, our CEO, and then the delegated authorities in terms of senior staff, as well as we've got divisional advisory boards, and it goes on. Then there is also, I think, what I've witnessed in my experience in Australian Red Cross, the informal volunteer leader roles. And I say that in that I have been myself inspired by many people and been, that privileged opportunity to, as a national youth member, having had the opportunity to sort of see and learn about what's happening around the country. And quite often I'm actually learning a lot and being inspired by those that would not be seen as holding those formal leadership roles, but I can see the influence that they have on others, and of course then the influence on me as well. So in that sense, I think of leadership in that way. In terms of whether, in answering the question, is there room for volunteer leaders, I think, well, the simple answer is yes, but I think it's yes to volunteer leaders in both the formal and informal capacities in which Australian Red Cross requires. I think that in terms of any kind of organisation, this kind of concept is necessary to have the leaders, for an organisation, whether it be an NGO, a humanitarian organisation like Red Cross, or even a corporate organisation. You want to create opportunities for people to take up those informal leadership roles if they so choose to, but also have those formal roles. And I think it becomes even more critical to have those volunteer leader roles in the informal and formal capacity in terms of what we do here in Australian Red Cross, because at the end of the day, I think it achieves a number of end goals that we're ultimately trying to do when we talk about the power of humanity to address, people in times of vulnerability and in trying to address those actual concerns. It's not about, I hope, it's not about Australian Red Cross always responding to need, but being able to empower local communities to respond to the need immediately, rather than necessarily relying on the intervention of Red Cross or any other humanitarian organisation. I mean, that's surely the end goal that we're trying to achieve. And I think when you incorporate volunteer leaders, there's a real potential there for Red Cross to really have that embedded in communities, so it's there whether or not Red Cross is there in the formal sense. So the second question was, should there be room for leaders? Well, obviously for Red Cross it's a yes, and I think the answers for me in terms of why that is so, or why we need volunteer leaders, is coupled from both the organisation perspective, but also I think from a volunteer's perspective themselves. One, I think it's a means of empowering people who experience the vulnerability itself. If we provide a pathway where we work with people during their times of vulnerability, but also allow them to bring them in to be part of the Red Cross family, so to speak, and give them those leadership opportunities, then you're in turn transforming someone who was a recipient of our assistance to also someone who's being empowered, and I think that's a really powerful thing to do for a community. I also do think it's a way of attracting supporters, and I think that's certainly how I sort of see my involvement over the years with Australian Red Cross is that as a volunteer, outside of Red Cross, I've got my networks with work, I've got social networks, which is slightly different. I don't sort of talk to my friends about passionately about the present litigation that I'm doing at work and the minutiae of that kind of legal world. It's just not interesting. But what I do talk about that I think is interesting and makes me a better person is the kind of connections or experiences that I have with Red Cross. And so my story is not unique. It happens across for many people and many people in this room. I think also it's recognition that from the organisation's perspective, and it kind of flows from the supporters, seeing volunteers as potential supporters, is that volunteers have the opportunity to choose where they volunteer. Some people will work somewhere for a salary because they have to in some instances, or it's all they can find. But a volunteer, can choose whether or not he or she wishes to volunteer. So automatically, I think from the organisation's perspective, we should see that there's untapped, well, not untapped, but there's this resource there, a very rich resource of a person who's actually putting their hand up before they've even done anything and saying to you, I'm already a supporter. So if you can enhance that, I think that's a really powerful thing, that they could become, in effect, your natural advocates. Also, I think, which is touched on earlier, is the ability for volunteers to bring a unique perspective, a perspective that's perhaps outside of the organisation, and being able to challenge the organisation and ensure, I guess, at the end of the day, particularly for Australian Red Cross, we want to remain relevant to the communities that we serve. And so by ensuring that volunteers, in particular volunteer leader roles, are available in the organisation is also a way to ensure that the organisation remains relevant and current with the times, and so that you always have that outside influence as well. And then finally as well, I think it builds the capacity of communities generally. So does Australian Red Cross, this is the third question that I thought about, was do we presently have room for volunteer leaders, both in the formal and informal sense? I think that, first of all, going back to our principles of voluntary service, it's right there. Going back to our founder of the International Red Cross Red Crescent movement, Henri Dunant, was a volunteer who came up with an idea that now has resulted in this worldwide global movement. So I think there is room for it, certainly within the Australian Red Cross context. And we've made room for it, I think, in terms of the formal leadership positions that I was talking about before. And I think to some extent, we have got room for it in the informal sense. But I do think we can do a lot better there. And where I think that is so is the ability, I think, for Red Cross to really, from an internal perspective, I think we need to be better at communicating what kind of potential opportunities there are within this organisation, and there are plenty. Because on the one hand, we have these conversations where we talk about resourcing issues and issues where we can't achieve certain things because of the constraints of resources. But what we don't really talk about is, well, how could we create volunteer roles? Or we do talk about it sometimes, but maybe not enough. And trying to meet that resource need, because we do have a recognition of our name out there that we could, really utilise in that perspective. And I think in some ways, so we need to work better on that, but also I think my own story itself, in terms of my volunteer role within Australian Red Cross, is an example of where we do from time to time create those informal leadership roles, which then lead on to the formal leadership roles. I started off as a volunteer when I was at university. I rocked up to a seminar that Red Cross was running on the laws of war. And from there, I sort of got more and more involved. I went up and said, oh, look, would you like me to help promote this more widely to my peers? Answer was yes. And from there, I started informally volunteering. And then before I knew it, I was invited to then join a committee. But all of that so far has relied on, I think, sort of ad hoc approaches. It's relied heavily on a particular, whether it be a particular staff member or particular volunteer leaders already in the organisation, taking the time to actually foster that informal leadership role. But it's also, I think, certain barriers which we also need to address within the organisation that are, either perceived as bureaucratic or in a very formal sense. A lot of our communications, for example, around decision making for leaders is all written communications. It's all about dealing things in that way. And I think that we need to also think more broadly about how we actually try and enable leaders to make decisions. It doesn't necessarily have to be in that formal sort of setting that we're used to, because we can model that quite easily from the corporate sector and what we know and what we're familiar with. So I guess there's an opportunity there for Red Cross to be innovative about how it actually brings these leadership opportunities for people. So those are some of my thoughts for now, and I think that's where, from my perspective, the Australian Red Cross could look at a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. Thank you very much, Chris, for those thoughts coming from a young head, which is wonderful. We've just got a bit of time in the middle here now, and I'd like to just give us an opportunity to open up some questions, or a couple of questions for both Brett and for Chris, before we move on to our final Chris, who comes from Red Cross. So is there a question for Brett from his conversation? Okay. There's a woman over the back there. Oh, hello. Hello, Tony. In a green suit. Is your question for Brett?
Yes, it is for Brett.
Yes, thank you.
Tony Aslett from Victoria, Brett, and you said that that you, and I'm paraphrasing, so I might not have got it correct, that we shouldn't have volunteers and staff trained in the same roles. And in emergency services, actually, we do. We have commanders who are volunteers and commanders who are staff. And so I'm just wondering about that statement you made, because I was a bit puzzled by it.
Yeah, and that's, thank you. And thanks for correcting me. I was really talking about and I've seen it in some organisations where I should have spoken about leaders in leadership roles. You can't have two leaders side by side. Well, they can be doing in different areas and that, but at the end of the day, if there's, with clarity of responsibilities and roles, you've also got to give clarity about authorities. And I'm probably not articulating it clearly. Just be aware of the potential for duplication and confusion where you have two people responsible for a team or an activity. That was what I was meant, not necessarily the operational or whatever. It's all about workforce planning as the key message, and I didn't speak. The messaging wasn't quite correct. I hope I've clarified it to a degree. No?
Yeah. So, Brett, are you suggesting that in one place, if you take like a geographic region and you've got an event, you've got a catastrophe or something going on, that you won't particularly want maybe a volunteer leader in that role and a staff member in that role doing the same job? Is that what you're suggesting, or is that what
from a practical example, I've seen organisations where there can be a committee or a group, a workforce with a chair who might be a volunteer and a staff member supporting that committee, where the staff member is responsible for delivering on certain outcomes, but could be directed by they both have similar roles and expected outcomes.
So
where does the buck stop in that situation?
I might, because Pat and I are co-chairs.
Yes, I was just going to raise that issue.
And Pat's a volunteer and I'm a staff member, so I'll talk to you later about that, Pat.
Yeah, okay, fine, okay.
And that's fine.
Either you stand down or I will.
But that's fine. That's about clarity of role, responsibility, and authorities. And that's what I was trying. To empower people, you've got to not only give them a task and the skills and the training, but empower them by giving them some authority. And you can't just be wary when you have two people exerting the same authority in the same activity.
Yes, and I can see there might be a confusion about, like, wanting to share that responsibility with volunteers and or community members, but there needs to be some clarity about what that might actually look like in reality. Okay, thank you very much. That might be another question around that. John's got his hand up across there. Is your question to Chris or to Brett? All right, yeah, we'll take one more for Brett and then we'll take a couple of questions for Chris. We go all right for time? Yep, okay, all right.
John Hood, just become a feather duster. Just before I came here from lunch, I saw Andrew Coughlin, who I think you said was in the back here somewhere. Can't see him now, but I did say to him, I'm going to this one to see how to replace him. But that's a real question. In terms of line type manager leaders, how do volunteers, the thing that worries me, how could a volunteer do that sort of a role in terms of, and I'm thinking of the time, the ability, I can understand the ability is definitely with volunteers, and if we could do that, that would be fantastic. But the average volunteer is not going to be prepared to give 365 days a year. And I just wonder if perhaps Brett, you might like to comment on that, or Chris, or Christine.
I think it's about clarity. Modern or volunteering, people usually don't volunteer their 80 hours a week. The days of giving your life, heart and soul to one cause, and that certainly exists in certain areas. However, it's not a realistic expectation in today's world. It's about unpacking what your outputs are, segmenting or isolating certain tasks. That's where you could bring in volunteers to help lead, develop achievable chunks of activities. And they could be intellectual activities, information activities, or practical activities. So I said it's not about replacing paid staff per se. And in fact, by incorporating and engaging more volunteers, be it at the front line or in the middle area or the leadership level, you really do need to boost your human resource or people management, your workforce training and development teams. Okay. And I suppose the next question is, can that be done with a mixture of paid and unpaid people? But again, it gets back to having a very smart workforce plan.
Okay, thank you, Chris. All right, Brett. Now, I'm going to open up the floor for a couple of questions for Chris before we move on to our final speaker. So we've got a person at the back there. We've got a mic going there. Yeah, great, thank you.
Hi, my name's Jade, Emergency Services Victoria. I'm a volunteer leader. As a volunteer leader, I represent Red Cross at municipal emergency management planning meetings. I sit at a table with Victoria Police, CFA, SES, MFB, DHS, and I wonder how I would react if I was asked to commit a Red Cross resource to an event or to an occasion that has been requested from the council. I don't know that I understand the capacity of Red Cross to be able to confidently commit a resource, and whether I have the authority to commit Red Cross to an event or to commit resources to an activity at council level. And that is something that I guess I've been thinking about over the last month. So Chris, so it really resonated when you said enable leaders to make decisions, and I think that's what I think we need to support our volunteers in giving them the authority to be able to make those decisions.
Yep, I am on. Thank you, Jade. I think that's right, but there is that element as well and putting on my old board hat that I don't wear anymore. But there is obviously the risk side as well of doing that. So I think, yeah, you're right. What we need to do a bit more of is explore that, be brave to think that is possible, and then also think together about, well, how do we manage that risk? Because, you don't necessarily always have volunteers who you know. So once you sort of put a policy in place, it can have a ripple effect. So you do need to have those things in place. But I do think where we do need to also put a bit more time and resources into is that the clarity of those lines, but also that training, so that people are aware, that volunteer leaders are aware of, well, what are the protocols that are necessary and that we need to follow to ensure that we manage that risk as well.
Okay, thank you. It seems some of these questions are now starting to get down to the really pithy level about like what would it look like in action, which is a really good place to actually be. And our last speaker is Chris Steinfort, who happens to be the Director of Human Resources in Australian Red Cross. So he's exactly the right sort of person to be targeting these sorts of questions to. So thank you very much, Chris. So to our last speaker. So Chris commenced with Australian Red Cross in 2008. Chris's role has a particular accountability for the development of frameworks, systems, tools, policies, procedures across a broad range of HR functions. So Human Resources aims to build the capacity, the capability and the culture of an organisation at each stage of a staff or volunteer member's life or life cycle. And Red Cross describes that as, you know, planning, how you attract volunteers, how you engage them, how you develop them, how you support and reward, retain and transition. So prior to Red Cross, Chris was the Executive Director of Human Resources with Alfred Health, which is a major metropolitan public sector health organisation here in Melbourne. His earlier HR roles were in private health with Affinity Health and Maine. And before Chris held operational HR roles in food manufacturing in Northern Victoria and Kraft Food. Chris commenced his professional life as a secondary teacher, then moving to education and training consultancy. He is a Victorian counsellor with Australian Human Resources Institute and previously undertook the Goulburn-Murray Community Leadership Program and the Commonwealth Study Program. So please give Chris a warm welcome.
Thanks, Pat, and good afternoon, everybody. I think it's fantastic to have about 150 people in the room together on this topic. And I was reflecting even at the start of the session in terms of what would have happened at the last national conference in Tasmania a few years ago, or previously in Brisbane. And Chris, you made a comment in terms of 100 years and 100 years of history and heritage and so on within Australian Red Cross, obviously Centenary here, and then looking back and looking forward. And with the fundamental principle of voluntary service over the last few years, I think we have been really going back over what does voluntary service mean, what does the fundamental principle mean, how do we bring that to life within Australian Red Cross, how should we continue to bring that to life and expand it even further. A couple of years ago I was in Perth, and at that time the WA Premier decided that the government would write to volunteers in 4 organisations who'd been with the organisation for at least 50 years. And Steve Joski, Executive Director of WA, was saying that there were some volunteers in WA who were getting one of those letters. In fact, there were 48 volunteers in WA who had more than 50 years volunteering experience in relationship with Red Cross. I thought, wow, that's a pretty amazing achievement. On the other hand, we know there are different trends in terms of volunteering, and certainly this week there have been quite a few discussions around youth engagement and the future ways in which people may connect with organisations and with causes. So I want to pick up a couple of comments, and I must admit it was interesting with Brett didn't actually tell you his second name is actually Chris. He hasn't declared that yet. Okay. But it was actually fascinating to listen to Chris and Christine and Brett Chris about the topics and about how many things that they were saying were very similar to things I said. Because I must admit, I looked at the question a few times this week and went, well, of course, like why are we even asking this question? And you know, what have I not understood? What am I missing? And so in one sense, it's just so obvious, like why do we even ask it? But in another sense, it's a really important thing. And the more I delved into it, and the more I asked different people, I wonder what's going on here? What are we really trying to get at? There is a whole lot which is underpinning it. So I'd like to pick up some of those examples, also conscious that hangs in the front and the timekeeper. I think the starting point, what became absolutely fundamental to the voluntary service strategy, which was signed off by the board last February, was about the nature of voluntary service and about the importance of voluntary service in building social capital and about social connectedness. So it's not voluntary service as a source of cheap labour. It's not volunteers as free labour. I think that's an extremely important point. The whole sense of voluntary service is about social capital and social connectedness. So if you start with that lens and if you start with that framework, then leadership is fundamental in communities. Leadership is fundamental in building social connectedness. Everyone in this room will have given some examples themselves and demonstrated some examples today of leadership at this event. thought leadership, looking after other people, assisting other people to be in certain rooms at certain times, challenging ideas, supporting, encouraging people. They're all examples and behaviours of leadership. I was interested and surprised in one way, an amazing session this morning, I think, from Lucy. I think she made a comment when she left school, she was, a young person with no skills or sort of entering, what would she do? I thought, no, clearly not, absolutely not. From the time she was born right through, there's obviously a whole range of skills and attributes being developed. And so from a Red Cross point of view, in terms of voluntary service, it's how do we really understand that sense of a social capital and social connectedness. Brett's made a few comments around Workforce Management 101. I just wanted to pick up a couple of things around that. When I first joined Red Cross, which was, as Pat said, 6 years ago, I was interested in other organisations and what they were doing with complex organisations with both staff and volunteer workforces. And certainly the life-saving associations and societies stood out in terms of fantastic examples, and particularly with young people going through and community-based. But I did actually visit, I won't name the state or territory, but a rural or a country fire authority type organisation. And what I was really surprised at, in a sense, there was when they looked at their workforce, they had people who fought fires or were involved in firefighting, and people who weren't involved in fighting fires. And when you looked at the people that were involved in fighting fires, they had people who were paid to do that and had an employment relationship, and they had people who weren't paid to do that and had a volunteer relationship. And so they actually didn't have a workforce, they had 3 workforces. And I couldn't help but think, and my background is not in firefighting, so maybe I just don't get it, but I couldn't help but think if I was a firefighter, be it paid or not paid, what's really important to me in that line of service and duty is that when I'm operating as a firefighter, I've got the technical skills, I'm part of a team, I can handle the pressure, I can work collaboratively, I can work in a safe manner, and I can look after my safety and other people's safety. And whether I'm paid or not paid is irrelevant. It's actually how does that team and how do we all work together? So then I was thinking about Red Cross and my experience in Red Cross. And a number of years ago in Ipswich, I was able to be at an evacuation centre which we were running in Ipswich for about a week. And what really struck me there was that I had no idea who was paid and who wasn't paid. I had no idea who was a staff member and a volunteer. But better than that, it just didn't matter. It was irrelevant. What we saw there, what we had there, was the Ipswich Evacuation Centre, which was being managed by Red Cross, and there are a whole range of people with a whole range of skill sets and roles and duties and clarification about what the duties are and what the boundaries are. But whether someone was paid or not paid, staff or volunteer, wasn't the point. It was about Red Cross people providing a service within the community. So completely joined up, and I can't help but contrast that with the firefighting example. The only other one I'll give quickly, and I think it's really important in terms of this sense of social capital and connectedness. A couple of years ago, I heard an MSP volunteer in WA, and she talked about how she was going to immigration detention centres with a staff member. And she explained the first time she went to the detention centre, the staff member introduced her and said, I'd like to introduce you to, I'll call the person Pat, I forget the person's name, I'm sorry, but I'll introduce you to Pat, and Pat's a volunteer with the Red Cross. Okay. A few months later, they went back for the second visit. Same staff member, same volunteer, and this time the staff member introduced Pat and said, I'd like to introduce you to a colleague of mine, Pat. A colleague. Really important word, just one word, what a difference that can make. But it's actually, it's not the word, it's the meaning of the word, and it's the sense of in it together. And therefore, leadership is everyone's accountability. Leadership is everyone's responsibility. That's what we bring to what we do. That's what we bring to who we are. I think sometimes in Red Cross, we haven't done this so well. I think sometimes in Red Cross, and I'll go out there, I guess, a bit, but I think sometimes we have been a bit patronising, dare I say it, in terms of the roles in which we've allocated to volunteers. And I even use that language quite deliberately because it's almost that sense. And again, I think it might have been Lucy this morning saying in some organisations, volunteers might do the lower skilled roles and so on. And I think sometimes that's the way Red Cross has actually set things up, and certainly that's been some of the feedback. I remember 5 years ago, business process improvement, 80 people, Sydney, 3 days, an amazing workshop, lots of fantastic ideas. How do we improve this organisation? At the end of the 3 days, everyone was thanked, as they should be. There were both staff and volunteers, but predominantly staff. And at the end of all the thank yous, someone said, and I'd particularly like to thank the 3 volunteers, and didn't they do an amazing contribution? And I've gone, well, of course they did, but why would you even need to say that? We didn't say to the other staff, you did an amazing contribution. We said those words to the volunteers. And I know that was meant with respect, but I can't help think sometimes the message is actually the other way, which is actually a bit undermining in terms of really respecting what the contribution is. So how then do we... the other thing I'll just say on that, I went to another seminar recently on corporate volunteering, and the organisations there were talking about skilled volunteers, where certain organisations might allow people to be seconded to certain not-for-profits for a period of time. I won't use that expression, skilled volunteering, because if Brett's a skilled volunteer, what's this volunteer? An unskilled volunteer? What's the language we're talking about there? So I'm really challenging, what's our language, what's our view, how do we interpret, how do we understand the meaning of voluntary service? And if we really get it, that it's about social connectedness and communities and long-term community development, then the question fades away, I think, in terms of its implication. In terms of workforce development, again, going back to Brett's comments around Workforce Management 101, and Pat referred to some of this in the introduction, how do we look at that in Red Cross? Well, we talk about the workforce, if I can use that language, in three ways. It's the capacity, it's the capability, and it's the culture. So the capacity is the right number of volunteers, the right number of staff, at the right time, in the right place. Okay? The capability is both technical, so what technically do I need to be good at? And what are my behaviours? What are the skill sets, the way in which I work together, the teamwork, the communication, the problem solving? So I need to be both technically competent and behaviourally competent, if you like. And the third part is the culture. And the culture is why I went back so much about the culture in Red Cross and the importance of that view about social connectedness. So again, 5 or 6 years ago, we had money for staff training, we had money for volunteer training. To be honest, both were completely all over the place. Even within staff training, it was very decentralised. We spent about half of the money we actually had. Within volunteer training, I don't actually even think we knew how much we really had for volunteer training. Over recent years, we've actually taken a view about being a learning organisation. What does that look like? It's about, among other things, having a workforce development plan. So how do we develop the technical competencies and the behavioural capabilities of our staff and our volunteers? It's not a staff plan, it's not a volunteer plan, it's a workforce plan, because that's how we should actually be working. As part of that, there are a number of leadership programs at various levels through the organisation, and for example, the Emerging Leader Program. The Emerging Leader Program, we've now undertaken 4 emerging leadership programs, probably the flagship leadership development program within the organisation. The first 2 years, it was only for staff, and it was really designed as a way of building the bench strength in terms of future around, for example, national leadership team roles. Okay. Then we said, why are we doing that? Where are the roles for volunteers? So in fact, then we've opened up the Emerging Leader Program so it's both staff and volunteers. And Lyndall, who's the chair of the Divisional Advisory Board in Tasmania, was part of the Emerging Leader Program last time. A much better example about growing leadership, both formally and informally, through the organisation. This year, there are 2 members of the Emerging Leader Program who are volunteers, and actually both from the youth part of the organisation. So if we're really serious about youth and growing youth in terms of future opportunities and present opportunities, then let's actually really put that into practice. I would just make one comment. I think there's my 1-minute bell. I will actually, because it's not all as perhaps as easy and as glossy as I've just gone over, there are some really clear challenges, and we shouldn't avoid these hard issues. In terms of the distinction between sometimes what is a staff role and what is a volunteer role, for example, in terms of employment relationships. And again, I'll name it. I'll name it within here. We're all family, it's Chatham House rules, but in terms of retail, for example. So retail has been predominantly volunteer managers, store managers in shops. A few years ago, the strategy was moved towards paid staff managers. And now the strategy's gone back to volunteer managers. So how do we handle that? How do we do that in a way which is fair to volunteers, because volunteers don't want to be in a situation where they're actually replacing a friend, colleague who's been made redundant. How do we be fair to the staff member through those sorts of changes? How do we make sure we carry out our industrial obligations? How do we make sure we remain consistent and faithful to codes of conduct, for example, in relation to volunteering? These are some really big and major challenges, I think, for all organisations, including Australian Red Cross. And as we want to be more together and more as one, we will have some of those challenges. Within HR, for example, we have about 60 volunteers within an HR team around Australia, and many as students, so perhaps doing a business management or a HR type course. How do we make sure that the work in which they're doing and the way in which we're supporting them is appropriate to the fact they're volunteering when they are actually absolutely working as part of a team doing in some ways similar sort of work to other people who are being paid? And I think part of that is the intent. The intent is actually not to get free labour to help us out. The intent is not to do that. The The intent is actually to provide learning opportunities for people as part of their career who are keen to work with a not-for-profit, who are keen to understand about humanitarian work, keen to get some work experience and keen to take those learnings back into their own studies, their own development. And actually making it really legitimate. It's okay as a volunteer to get something out of the volunteering experience. It is a two-way experience, it's a two-way experience, and that's fine too. Okay, I think I've covered off a number of things, but I guess in summary, I would actually say to each of the presenters, it's just fantastic to have this discussion with a group of external as well as internal people really contributing to what voluntary service means as part of our continuing journey. So, thank you.
Okay, well, we're at the end of our formal part of listening to our speakers. And first of all, I'd like to open up the floor for a question to Chris, because Chris has really presented us with a picture about what's already happening and the great opportunities that already exist within Red Cross. And I'd be interested to know from the floor about what your views are on that and any question you might have to Chris, and then we'll open it up generally for questions. So we have a woman down here. Okay, would you like to stand up and just say who you are? That's lovely, thank you.
I'm Liz and I work for the emergency services in Sydney. I find what you said quite inspiring actually, Chris.
Could you hold the microphone closer? Sorry,
yeah,
thank you.
Good, thank
I
you.
find what you said quite inspiring because what I get out of it is that it's not about whether you're paid or not. It's about getting the right skills and the right skill sets to do the right job. And I found that in emergency services, working alongside with staff, where they have said, I think you can do this better than we can. Because the staff don't necessarily have some of those skills that we can bring, and that's where the social connectedness comes in. What I find difficult as a volunteer, and that's something that you might be able to answer, is we're limited by the authority we have. As volunteers, we tend to defer to staff because we think, well, they're working for Red Cross, they know better. And they might not necessarily know better. So that's a difficult point. The other thing that I find difficult as a volunteer is to obtain the right information. And again, we think, well, staff, they get their emails and they get everything and they know what's going on, we don't. So that communication has to be improved. And finally, of course, our own time and commitment. We are limited by that. Whether we're retired like I am or whether we have somebody young like Chris, which is really nice to have young people here. So those are the limitations of what we can do, and yet there also are opportunities.
Okay, thank you. Chris, do you want to make a comment about those? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to pick up each of those three, and if I don't, please come back to me. I think the first one in delegations is really interesting. I was following the conversation before that Tony raised in terms of, say, dual reporting, so a committee led by a staff member as well as a volunteer, Pat, and yourself. And I think, Chris, you came back in terms of comment from a board perspective, it would have been around authority and, I might stand up, around authority and delegation. So basically the board has the authority to make decisions within Red Cross, and then it says to Robert as CEO, we'll delegate this to you, and then Robert says to a number of us, then Robert delegates to us certain levels of authority to make decisions. And it's actually highlighted for me, I must admit, I'd like to take it back on notice in terms of really understanding how much we're following that through in terms of volunteer delegation. Because again, if we take Brett's comment around Workforce Management 101, if what it is giving clarity to roles, then I would have thought the authority isn't whether someone's paid or not paid, it's whether they're actually in that particular position, and therefore that position needs authority. Likewise, the example before it being a certain meeting, if you are at a certain meeting representing Red Cross, then presumably you go with some authority in terms of that particular meeting. So it may well be that that's an area we need to take on notice again and actually go back about what the lines of authority and delegation are within roles which are typically filled more by volunteers. So,
Yes.
so that was the first one. The second, can you just remind me again, sorry, the second comment you made? Yeah, communication. Yeah, isn't this an amazing challenge? So this is absolutely so difficult. And it would be fair to say that if you look over the last 7 or 8 years, so there was one Red Cross, but really we had Red Cross in every state and territory with their own systems or lack of systems, their own technology or lack of technology. We've tried to bring that together. It's been a major investment, continues to be a major investment. It's still not where it needs to be. In terms of the HR space, for example, the organisation's invested heavily in, for example, payroll, and clearly we need to make sure, and we had 8 payroll systems run by finance and some outsourced, and we've gone to 1 payroll system, so we absolutely have to get that right because of our legal obligations. I'm sure you'd all agree. We haven't at this stage invested as much in terms of IT systems and so on around volunteer and volunteer management. As you know, we're all still working through Mavis, which is a product which really should have been retired gracefully probably some time ago. and so it's extremely difficult for the organisation in terms of communication. So how do we actually get to everyone and communicate? We're going to have this early next year as an issue. So for the first time ever, we're doing a national survey of all volunteers around Australia about what the volunteering experience is like. So why do people join? What's happening? What's the experience like? So 30 or so thousand volunteers. And so how do we actually distribute that given the lack of really reliable, robust data? So communication is absolutely an issue. The third point I think you made in terms of time and commitment, and I think Chris might have made a comment about choice. I have a slightly different view around that. I actually think everyone has choices. And again, maybe I'm naive, but certainly at any staff induction program, the opening comment I always make is thank you for joining Red Cross. And Red Cross should never take your employment decision for granted, because you're in an employment market, you're making decisions, and you've got a choice whether you spend your time with Red Cross or whether you spend it somewhere else. I don't have the traditional view of Red Cross or recruitment being big funnels and the organisation has all the power and the individual has none of the power. That's never been my view. Okay. And likewise, absolutely with volunteering, volunteers have huge choices, whether to be part of organisations or not, whether to act informally or formally, whether to use social media, as we talked about before, rather than some of the structures in the organisations. So everybody has choice. And what we must never do is take your choice for granted. You must never take that for granted. So we've really got to understand what's the choice, why are you making that, what are your expectations, what can the organisation do in terms of meeting those expectations. And where we understand the expectations of a volunteer and the expectations of the organisation, and where they align, it's a happy relationship. If they're not aligning, it's not going to be a happy relationship. So we really have to understand that, which is one of the reasons we're doing the survey next year. I could also say, while I have the floor to Pat just for a moment, we actually commissioned an external company a few years ago to do some research in terms of volunteers who had left. And we actually asked them to ring volunteers for about a 20-minute survey, confidential, anonymous and so on, all the results obviously being collated. And we chose 3 programs. So we chose emergency services and retail and Save a Mate. We did that very deliberately, Save a Mate, in terms of a program which typically attracts younger volunteers. And these people had all left the organisation. Well, having said that, some actually were still with the organisation, but our record said they'd left, which goes to the point about how bad our systems are. And some actually thought they never actually got in to become a volunteer, even though we said they'd been a volunteer and left. So, no, that was pretty embarrassing. But what happened in terms of emergency services, people who were emergency services volunteers who left, typically left because they weren't called up enough. I'll be very honest about it. And they actually went and joined another organisation where they were called up more. That's why they typically left. Maybe the SES and so on they would have moved on to. Retail volunteers typically left because they were an older cohort and typically left because of their health or partner's health or looking after other people in terms of health. Would have loved to have stayed with Red Cross, would have loved to have stayed in retail, very loyal to the shop, the people they worked with, but for reasons outside the control of Red Cross left. Save a Mate volunteers typically left because they were younger people doing uni, liked to go to the music festival as well, dipped in and out a couple of times during the year, then graduated, therefore moved on from that, but felt really good about Red Cross, would come back in the future.
Okay,
thanks.
Chris. I know that Brett wants to add to this conversation. And then there's a question down here, and then one over here, okay?
Just very quickly, on the communication issue, just be careful what you wish for, because I've been to lots of forums and lots of organisations where I get bombarded with too much information, and the person next to them says, but nobody tells me anything. So, putting the right communication strategy, opt-in, opt-out, and to get information that you want, that's the challenge in whatever communication systems or infrastructure you develop.
Yes, you might ask for something that you don't really want. So 50,000 emails. Okay, there's a couple of people here we're going to take questions from. So you're both, I'm looking at you two. So you first, this young lady here, the purple shirt, and then over there the white shirt. Okay, thank you.
This question, I guess, is directed at Chris, and I'm looking for more of a youth perspective.
Could you stand up, please?
Which Chris?
Yep, sorry. Oh, Chris Kwong. You mentioned that recruiting volunteer leaders is a good way to empower those who experience vulnerability. Did you hear the first part of the question? Yeah. Do you think Red Cross is achieving a balance between recruiting volunteers who experience vulnerability and those who are looking to advance their career prospects, as Chris and Brett had previously mentioned?
In terms of whether or not we've got the right balance, I think, I don't think I'm in a position to answer that, and I don't think the organisation is in a position to answer that. And the reason I say that is because I think people need to want to be in that volunteer leadership role, and so we've got to respect that. But in terms of what I guess we've explored in pockets, and we need to keep, as Chris Steinford said, that we need to be working on is making it more a part of what we do in everything that we do. And what I mean by that is that I've seen examples where I think that balance has been struck in a particular circumstance, in a particular context, but it's not something which is across the board. And what I've found in my experience is quite reliant on that particular, whether it be a program leader that actually recognises that opportunity, rather than a systemic kind of, this is how we do things. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. One last question across here, down here. There was one more. Oh, one more after that? Okay, one quick one after that, that'll be good.
Hi, Ash from WA. So this is kind of triggered by Chris Steinford talking about the longevity of volunteer leaders, and you used the example of WA as well. What I was wondering when looking at the question is, not only is there room, but is there room for new volunteers? When we think about the organisation, we need a renewal of volunteer leaders and to ensure the security and the health of the organisation. So how do we create a process that's positive and fair, but also ensures succession? So ensures that we're making room for new leaders, making spaces for new leaders to come through, while still respecting and valuing the service of previous volunteers. And it's sort of for everyone, but particularly triggered by Chris.
We've got time for short responses here to that question.
You're talking both in terms of formally and informally, in terms of leadership positions? Yeah. Look, I might make a comment first, and great to hear from others as well. It was interesting this week, there are a number of sessions around youth engagement, and on Wednesday afternoon, it's been a long week already, but on Wednesday afternoon, the national leadership team managed to catch up with this particular forum, and for about 2 hours there's a discussion around how we continue to increase the youth voice within the organisation, and not just for the present, not just for the future, but for the present as well, which I thought was a really key discussion. And what it's really highlighted for me, or one of the things that highlighted for me, was just the importance of making sure we build that into everything we do. And I did actually offer on that day, Ash, as you know, in terms of, for example, around the recruitment process or around learning and development, but really keen that through HR we link in much more with the youth voice. And I think perhaps to your previous question, I think I absolutely agree with Chris's answer, but part of it is actually about the lack of data to be able to give a really informed answer. And so what I think as an organisation we need to be able to do is to define, I'll use the language, my language, but what does good look like? So what do we want that to be like? So what do we want in terms of youth and youth leadership and examples right across the organisation? So we need to define what that looks like, and then we need to start to measure it to see how it's actually working, and then we need to have plans to increase it where it's not actually where it needs to be. So part of my answer to your question would have been a bit hypothetical in a sense like yours as well, because we don't have all the data, and probably Ash, to your question as well, we actually need to make that more explicit and really bring it to life more. And there was discussion the other day in terms, again, youth engagement, which sits within Michael's area, so Director of Services and International Operations, but it's really a whole of organisations. So it's within services in Australia, it's within international program, it's within support functions like IT, finance, HR, and it's within the commercial operations of the organisation. So one of the things which I'm feeling quite rejuvenated about from this week is actually how we bring that conversation to life more.
Okay, we're sort of out of time now, but what I'm going to encourage you to do is that before you go off for afternoon tea, if you've got another question you want to come and ask any of our panel members, be happy to hang around for sort of 5 or 10 minutes. Would that be all right? Okay. I just want to wrap this session up. We've heard 4 quite different views really from people about should volunteers be leaders, and everyone said yes. Well, of course, we knew they were going to say that. That's why we posed them the question. But what we've learned, I think, is a whole lot of complexities actually that are involved in that, and some good ideas about how that might be undertaken. It's really clear that it needs to be linked into strategic planning. There need to be opportunities for training. There need to be a clear role with definitions for volunteers, and particularly it's been raised from the floor about the issue of authority. If you send a volunteer in a leadership role into something, what authority do they actually have? And I think that's something that Red Cross needs to take on board and have a bit of a think about. And I'd like to leave you with a couple of questions, really. After listening to all these people, two things come to my mind. One is, do volunteers wait to be invited into leadership roles, or do volunteers and community members step up and say, I want a leadership role? So I'd like to thank our 4 panel members, Brett, Chris, and Chris. And I'd like you to join with me with giving them a very warm welcome and thank you.